So, the economic divide between the richest and poorest Americans has been growing for decades, and while many have complained bitterly about it, including me, we have not moved significantly in the direction of a more egalitarian society. And prospects for that happening in the near future do appear a bit bleak. So today I'd like to consider kind of what brought these disparities into our culture, what impact those disparities might be having on our society and maybe on us as individuals, and what we might do to help move things in the direction of greater equality. So a number of years ago, Jared Diamond wrote a book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. He was trying to answer a question, and it's a question that came up in a conversation he had with a man named Yali, who was a New Guinean politician. The conversation turned to the obvious differences in power and technology between Yali's people and the Europeans who dominated the land for 200 years. Differences that neither of them considered due to any genetic superiority of the Europeans. Yali asked, using the local term cargo, which is the term they use for inventions and manufactured goods, and he asked, "Why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own? Why did you have so much when we had little of our own?" And so Guns, Germs, and Steel is a way to look at what conditions might result in a culture having a lot of cargo. Right? That was the idea here. And Diamond was really quite clear in saying, it's really not a matter of merit that this happens. In other words, if you look across the constellation of people in different cultures, people are pretty much as intelligent as each other wherever you go. All right, so the difference isn't around there. But the difference do seem to be a matter of geography and a couple other items having to do with natural resources and the capacity to make use of them. So here's what he says. The first step towards civilization, that is the move from being a nomadic hunter-gatherer group to a more agrarian and settled group, you have to meet several conditions. You need access to high-carbohydrate vegetation that will give you storage capacity, right? A climate dry enough to allow for that storage, and then access to animals docile enough for domestication and versatile enough to survive captivity. Intriguing, right? Is that what we really thought of in terms of why we have so much in that? But the fact is, if you have those three conditions met in your area, you have many more possibilities for how your group can organize. All right? So basically, when you have control of crops and livestock, then you can get food surpluses. When you have surpluses, you have more freedom for people to specialize. Right? And that specialization prompts more population growth. Right? You really can't have a city unless you have the capacity for excess surplus food. Right? So the combination of specialization and population growth leads to the accumulation of social and technological innovations which build on each other. So large societies develop ruling classes, supporting bureaucracies, which in turn lead to the organization of nation states and empires. But it all begins with those three simple things: living in the right climate, having the kind of food that you can store and the storage capacity to do it, and just enough organization so that you can start growing as a population and enhance all those items, right? And so doing that, a number of countries have really developed themselves into very strong market economies and have huge GNPs, etc. The thing is, there's also a fair amount of variation in terms of how those different countries work out their economic systems. All right. Now, one might think, in light of Occupy Wall Street, that unequal distribution of wealth in this country had the greatest disparity of any. Right. That the difference between the richest and the poorest here is stronger than any other place in the universe, right, or certainly in the world. But that would be wrong. We're actually second place. Yes, it turns out that in Singapore, if you look at the top 20% of earners compared to the bottom 20% of earners, in Singapore, that's 9.7 times higher for the top 20% than there is for the lowest 20%. Right? That's significant. The United States is only 8.5%, so which is still huge disparity. And you can compare that with countries such as it's twice as great as the disparities in Japan, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. All right, and our disparity has continued to grow and substantially, I might add, and over across the several decades. So I got these numbers from a TED Talk by a person named Richard Wilkinson, who's a public health researcher. And the title of this talk is How Economic Inequality Harms Societies. Because what he looked at, if you take a look at the so-called developed countries, those countries with relatively well-developed democracies and market economies, if you look at them in terms of their outcomes for health and other kind of things like that, you'll find that there's no relation between their gross national product and their success or level of problems, social problems that they have. All right. So in other words, a poor country may have fewer problems than a wealthy country, but it's really hard to predict who's going to have more problems and who's not. Because if you just look at the raw numbers, it doesn't seem like being poor really makes your country's situation so much worse. But if you take it instead to look at the disparities between the richest and the poorest, everything flips. And that there's a strong correlation between high disparity and high problems. So they looked at life expectancy, kids' math and literacy scores, infant mortality rates, homicide rates, proportion of the population in prison, teenage birth rates, levels of trust, obesity, mental illness and drug addiction, social mobility. And the United States, having such a large disparity, was like on the bottom. We had more problems in these areas than any other country. And the countries that had the lightest disparity, those groups that I mentioned before, they had the fewest problems in those areas. Right? Actually, one of the remarkable things is social mobility. People like to think about the American dream of anybody can be successful. And what the Wilkinson said is, well, if Americans want to live the American dream, they should go to Denmark, because Denmark apparently has much greater social mobility than we'll ever have, apparently. So anyway, the thing is, his main point is that the average well-being of societies is not dependent on whether you're a strong or weak economic power. All right? And it's still the fact that it makes a lot more difference if your country is poor, whether or not you have a substantial economy, right? Because there are certain services and all that can make a difference there. But for those that are at a level where they have fairly strong market economies, it doesn't really make a difference whether they have a lot of money or a little bit of money. But looking at the level of disparity within a country really will make a difference. And it's not just the poor that actually do worse on these problems. Right? That was the more remarkable thing for me. When you look at the incidence of these problems going across the economic spectrum, the rich really have as many problems, or almost as many problems, as the poorest. Right? And certainly their kids do if they don't personally. And so you have a situation now where the entire society suffers from the disparity. Right? The entire society suffers from the disparity. And the countries that have the lowest disparity don't always have the same mechanism for lowering that disparity. Right? So for instance, in Sweden and some of the other Nordic countries, they have very large income disparities, right? The top earners earn a lot more than the lowest earners, but they have very high taxation, all right? And they have very strong social welfare programs to make sure everyone's got a floor. Japan, on the other hand, really doesn't have that much going on in terms of taxation or even the economic floor programs, but they have very low disparity. In other words, the top earners don't earn that much more than the lowest earners in comparison to other countries. And the researchers are saying, either way you slice it, it's better for your country if you can have less disparity. Right? So working to that end would be better for you and better for everyone. In other words, the entire country benefits if you do that. But you might notice we kind of haven't gone in that direction. And in fact, any mention of going in that direction seems to get a lot of pushback, right? So why is it that people are so caught up in the way that we have things, and this fantasy of an American dream, and this fantasy of this notion that really what makes a difference is how hard people are working, right? Because we know that's just not the case. Well, there is where'd it go now? Oops, sorry. A good chunk of it has to do with the idea that when people have cash, they need to kind of justify having it. So there's a psychologist named Ellen Hendrickson. She did a nice little thing on 5 ways money may be costing your humanity. So she was looking at various research efforts to look at what happens when you compare people who have a lot of money to people who have little money. You might have heard of some of these already. You know about the pedestrian crossing one and the cars? That made the news. So they had these pedestrians go at this fairly busy corner, and they would kind of walk out into the street and see what happened when cars came by. And remarkably, like 80% of the cars really stopped and let the pedestrian go without running them over, or even trying to. And so they said, well, that's actually pretty good. But then they started looking a little bit harder at the pictures of the cars involved. And so if it was a beat-up wreck, almost 100% of them stopped. What if it was a BMW? No. 40%. 40%. That's probably being generous. All right? People who have more are less likely, in this scenario apparently, to show common courtesy. Right? They don't need to. Why would they? They also find that people who have more tend to have less empathy for those who don't. So here's one. In this study, participants were asked to self-identify their social class using a picture of a ladder with rungs on it labeled 1 to 10, with the lowest rungs representing those who are worst off, have least education, least money, and least respected jobs or no job. And the highest were those who are best off, have the most education, most money, and most respected jobs. So once the participants self-identified on the 1 to 10 ladder, they are asked to participate in a hypothetical job interview. And the researcher interviewed 2 participants at a time, asking them standard questions like, what are your greatest strengths and weaknesses? And afterwards, the participant rated to what extent they felt 20 different emotions such as anger, contempt, sadness, hope, surprise, and worry during the interview. But then there was a twist. They are asked to rate how strongly they thought their interview counterpart felt each emotion. The result? Lower class participants, in other words, those who self-identified as being on the lower rungs, were more accurate than higher class participants at judging the emotions of their interview partner. Right? Remember, you're doing the ratings on both of those, and so you're rating for yourself and you're rating for the other person. Those people who were on the lowest piece had much better radar in terms of what somebody might be feeling. Right? So it's a measure of empathy. Right? So your empathy might be a little bit compromised if you've got a lot of cash, apparently. Compassion. In this study, researchers asked participants to watch 2 short videos while hooked up to a heart rate monitor. One was an instructional video where a woman explained how to build a patio wall, while the other was a documentary clip of kids with cancer going through chemotherapy. Now, everybody, of course, felt some level of concern for the cancer person compared to the instructional video. But there's a significant difference. The people who had more really were affected much less than the people who had the least. How about helpfulness? Well, here people were given either $4,000 in Monopoly money or $200 in Monopoly money and asked to imagine a future in which their finances were strained for the first group. And the first were to ask, imagine a future if they were rich. And then they filled out some bogus forms, got up to leave, thinking the study was over, but it had just begun. As each participant made their way out, a researcher carrying a pile of office supplies walked in front of them and accidentally spilled a box of exactly 27 pencils. Now came the real question, how many pencils would each person pick up? Any recommendations here? Well, nobody didn't pick up any pencils, right? Even the people that had the $4,000 and thinking about their great future picked up something. But the people who had the lower amount picked up significantly more. All right, so maybe we're not going to be as helpful either. How about ethics? Well, here's one. After filling out some forms as a distraction, participants were shown a jar of candy and told it was for kids participating in studies in another lab. Then the researchers simply counted how many candies each participant took, without being invited to, I might add. Now, those who were primed to think of themselves as comparatively wealthy took a lot more candy than people who didn't. I guess it's not all about need. So the psychologist says, look, there's a number of things at play here that probably go into how people's personalities might be transformed by their financial situation, right? So the first, she says, is probably a mindset of independence versus interdependence, right? One of the great fantasies of being rich is that it's all yours, and you can do with it as you like, and no one will take it away from you. So as long as you have enough of it, you'll have a lot of independence, right? You don't have to worry that somebody else is going to help you make your rent, or keep you from eviction, or whatever else, right? The idea of self-sufficiency, the notion that not only do you not need people to be taken care of you, but you can just be self-sufficient. As long as you can make your own little world around you, you'll be fine. A greater sense of entitlement, right? Once you have this, one of the ways people deal with it is by justifying what they've got and telling themselves that I earned it, or it was coming to me, or however else they want to do it, but really developing that sense of entitlement that comes. And in all, these things wind up then becoming kind of a filter that we can use to buffer ourselves against any misgivings that we might have about inequality or other kind of things like that. All right? So, if you really want to preserve your humanity, chances are you do best to get rid of all your money, right? Because your money apparently is not so helpful there. Right? Thing is, what they did find is that they could help people turn things around and develop a stronger communitarian sense by asking people to picture themselves. Remember that ladder with the 10 steps, 10 rungs on it? Ask people to picture themselves in relation to those on the bottom rungs. And when they did that and tested them, people's empathy and their accuracy in detecting emotions did improve considerably. All right, so there really is a way to call people's attention to things and get some people going. However, we have a very large economy that we're dealing with here. And you may remember a while back I talked about Theory Q. Theory Q basically says that one of the things about humanity is they're very good at organizing, and they're very good at organizing for things that have bad outcomes. All right? And then not so good at disorganizing. In other words, getting out of things that are harmful is much more difficult than getting into them. Right? Not that we ever see that. So we have a situation here, I think, where we have developed an economy that has got a mind of its own and a lot of steam of its own. There's an environmental scholar and activist, Vandana Shiva, says, over time, money took over not as a means, but as a measure of wealth, and slowly started to displace the real wealth-creating capacity of people, and displace the wealth-creating capacity of nature. In other words, the economy's got a mind of its own. Let's remember, the economy is made up of this human-created thing called money, which really has no real intrinsic value, and yet so much goes into it. So going back to Jared Diamond, one of the things that he was very interested in is how groups would maintain the hierarchy of control and domination over economies. And he used the word kleptocracy to describe this. Kleptocracy. You may recognize that like from kleptomaniac. It has to do with stealing. So Wikipedia's definition is a government with corrupt rulers also known as kleptocrats, that use their power to exploit the people and natural resources of their own territory in order to extend their personal wealth and political power. Typically, this system involves the embezzlement of state funds at the expense of the wider population, sometimes without even the pretense of honest service. Now, I don't think we see that in our country, do we? Kleptocracy? A sense of kind of using the resources for their own gain. It's scary, really, when you think about it. And the thing is, when we allow ourselves to buy in to the money piece, we're actually carving off a significant chunk of our humanity, right? A year or so ago, I did an address on money, and one of the things that I talked about at that time was the difference between a market economy and a gift economy. And where is it now? And this is Charles Eisenstein. And it says, in former times, people depended for all of life's necessities and pleasures on people they knew personally. If you alienated the local blacksmith, brewer, or doctor, there was no replacement. Your quality of life would be much lower. If you alienated your neighbors, then you might not have help if you sprained your ankle during the harvest season, or if your barn burnt down. Community was not an add-on to life. It was a way of life. Today, with only slight exaggeration, we could say we don't need anyone. I don't need the farmer who grew my food so I can pay someone else to do it. I don't need the mechanic who fixed my car. I don't need the trucker who brought my shoes to the store. I don't need any of the people who produced any of the things I use. I just need someone to do their jobs, but not the unique individual people. They are replaceable. And by the same token, so am I. When we carve out our life and let money come into it, we lose a lot of capacity to really feel connected and to appreciate what is going on. Dan Ariely, Predictably Irrational, Revised and Expanded Edition, had this to say. There's a nice little vignette here. This is, again, about how money changes things. You were at your mother-in-law's house for Thanksgiving dinner. And what a sumptuous spread she has put on the table for you. The turkey is roasted to a golden brown. The stuffing is homemade and exactly the way you like it. Your kids are delighted. The sweet potatoes are crowned with marshmallows. And your wife is flattered. Her favorite recipe for pumpkin pie has been chosen for dessert. The festivities continue into the late afternoon. You loosen your belt and sip a glass of wine. Gazing fondly across the table at your mother-in-law, you rise to your feet, pull out your wallet. Mom, for all the love you put into this, how much do I owe you? You say this sincerely. As silence descends on the gathering, you wave a handful of bills. Do you think $300 will do it? No, wait, no. I should give you $400. How does that sit for you guys? You like it? Can you imagine that at your own meal? Wouldn't you appreciate that if you really did this meal and somebody wants to pay it? And I see their faces are showing no. Okay. So the point of this is there are so many things that we're happy to do for each other. All right? But when you start putting money into the equation, there's a break. Right? One of the examples he gives, he says, say you find a flat tire on your car and you go into a diner and you say, is there anyone here who could help me fix a flat tire? And somebody says, yeah, I'll do it. I said, great, I'll give you $1. How's that going to go over? Right? When we start putting a value on things. And let's remember, money was the first digital revolution. The first digital revolution, right? Many, many, many hundreds of years ago. Because that's when we wound up finding a somewhat objective point of view to say this is what something is worth. Right? And to have it be one that would stick from place to place. But there's a loss with that. Right? Just like there's a loss of fidelity when you just have ones and zeros making your music. There's a loss that comes with this because there is a feeling that is no longer accounted for. Right? When we go to the store and we buy apples, are we really thinking about the people who pluck those apples and pulled them together, made those bushels happen. Remember, we had the Immokalee farm workers saying not too long ago, when we talked about tomatoes and the bushel of tomatoes, how each one of those bushels was how much? 32 pounds, right? And how much did they get for it? They were getting 50 cents for that bushel, right? And then it became 83 cents, right? Think about what it's like now to imagine somebody carrying that bushel of tomatoes, right? And putting it on the scale to make sure that they're getting what they are due, right? Compare that to just standing in the store and plucking something off the shelf. We lose so much connection with the world around us. And that loss of connection is making it much harder for us to push back against the market economy. In other words, we're in it. We're in it deep. And finding a way out of it is not going to be simple or fast. All right. But let's figure out if there are some ways to move in that direction. Moving to the end. So what are we to do? Well, first let's get our own head straight about how we relate to money and wealth. And let's recognize that we are in many ways willing captives of the market economy. Right? We're not really fighting back all that much, even if we protest. Next, let's unpack and expose the domination culture that goes with this. Right? We have people in power who are saying because they have accumulated wealth, they have access to wealth, they can do whatever they like in public and there'll be no consequences. We have people with incredible wealth saying that they deserve it, that it's all theirs and that they worked hard for it. And that once they have it, they can tell people what to do, how to live their lives. Right? We need to expose these ideas for what they are, which are lies. Lies. And let's be sure to highlight the downsides. Let's remember how deep the problems are in this country compared to other countries that have less disparity. We're off the charts for a number of these issues, like mass incarceration, mental health problems. We're off the charts. Generosity begins at home. If we wait until we're satisfied that our future is secure before we start giving generously, it's too late, right? And what we're really doing is just supporting and deepening the status quo. If we're serious about reducing inequality, we've got to step up our giving. One of the ways to do that, by the way, Michael Eric Dyson has a book out recently, Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America, where he talks about the importance of us finding a way to make reparations to the blacks in our country that have continued to suffer for decades and hundreds of years at this point, centuries. Anyway, one of the things he says you can do in your own small way is you can pay more to blacks who do work for you. Right? Pay more than they ask you to. Pay more than you would pay somebody else. Maybe it's not fair, but that's part of the point, isn't it? There has been a lack of fairness altogether. And doing a little bit more, paying the person who's providing service to you a little bit more than you otherwise would, is at least making a small dent in the uneven playing field and making it a little bit better for people. Work to desegregate our communities with fair and affordable housing. There is so much resistance to making fair and affordable housing in so many of our communities. We can make a difference there if we speak up loud and persistently. Because the communities have painted themselves into a corner. Right? If you have a community where your property values are high, you're going to have a very, very difficult time getting your population of homeowners to agree that affordable housing is a good idea. But they're losing people at a great rate. People can't afford to live in these communities. People don't want to live in the kind of housing that they built that is so expensive. And unless they can hear a clear, persistent message that a variety of housing makes more sense even for Scarsdale and Chappaqua and Harrison, unless a variety of housing makes more sense for these communities, it's going to be very difficult to get the communities to start moving this direction. But we can, and we should. And most important, spend more time relating to people. Get on a first-name basis with people who are different and who are on different rungs of the economic ladder than you are. And that goes both ways. We may have sacrificed our humanity to money and markets, but the remedy is available if we choose to use it.